Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, April 1st, and we will hear approaches to design review, improving the process and collaborative efforts. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the questions box in your GoToWebinar tool panel, and I will do my best to answer those tech questions. For your content questions related to the presentation, again, just type those in that questions box, and we will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. If your question is for a particular panelist, I would ask that you state that in your question. That just helps me field things and get things all ready to ask our panelists at the end during the Q&A. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2022. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today, our guest host is the Illinois chapter of APA. You have been a member for quite some time, and we appreciate you and the session that you have brought today. You'll hear just a smidge more about them in just a moment. Today's session has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing. You can record your credits by heading over to planning.org, and you can log into your My APA account. From there, you can search either by today's title or event number, both of which can be found on our webcast website, which is ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And if you need a certificate for attending today's session, you will be receiving a follow-up email from GoToWebinar, and a link to download a certificate will be available in that email, so don't trash it if you need a certificate for any other type of certifications that you're using this session for. If you're on social media, let's be friends. Like us on Facebook. That's where I post any important date or time changes. I also give notice when we have upcoming sessions that are available for you to register for. So be sure to like us on Facebook to get all that info. And we record all of our sessions and we post them onto our YouTube channel. So be sure to subscribe to us. Just search Planning Webcast Series and we'll pop up along with our well over 400 video recording sessions. So be sure to subscribe to us so you get notified when we have another session available for you to view. So again, just to recap, head over to ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast to register for all of our upcoming sessions, to get information on previous sessions like recordings and CM credit information. And if you have any questions for today's panelists, just type them in your questions box and we'll get to those today at the end of our presentations during the Q&A. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom, who's going to kick things off. And Tom, I'm turning it over now to you shortly. Let me get my screen. All right. Tom Farasi, did I say it right?
You did, yes, thank you.
Thank you. Well, hey. I did just hear it like 30 seconds ago when you told me, so thank you.
Thank you, and hopefully my screen's up there now. Perfect, okay. Again, thank you, Christine. My name is Tom Farasi. I'm the Planning and Economic Development Manager with the Village of Carroll Stream in Carroll Stream, Illinois. And I'm also this year's Advisory Committee Chairman for the Municipal Design Review Network, or MDRN. We're excited to be kind of co-hosting this national webcast once again, second year in a row with Illinois APA and their Chicago Metro section. If you're not familiar with MDRN, we are a kind of a networking group in the Chicago area, and we focus on design review. We try to have programs throughout the year, and we touch on obviously design review related programs. Those programs have included things on community branding. We've had an all-day sustainability program in the past. We've looked at, again, just a variety of design review topics, and so we're excited again to be kind of partnering with the Chicago Metro section of Illinois APA on this topic to discuss approaches to design review in both urban and suburban areas. So I will switch things over to Kimberly Morris with Chicago Metro section.
Great, thank you so much, Tom. So like Tom said, my name is Kimberly Morris. I am Assistant Director with the APA Illinois Chicago Metro section, which is a subsection of APA Illinois. I want to first thank APA Ohio and MDRN for their collaboration on what's to be a great event for this afternoon. Before we begin, I just want to give a quick couple announcement about some upcoming APA Illinois events. So first is our annual bar exam that is happening on April 6th. So this is a trivia style event that's aims to test kind of your knowledge in all things planning and law. So, and there's also a great networking component. And so looking forward to having everyone out on April 6th at the Haymarket Brew Pub. That is if you are local to Chicago, as it is an in-person event. And then the next will be our Illinois State Section Spring Conference, which is both held virtually and in person, and that is coming up on May 12th and 13th. So for more information on these events, any of our upcoming events with CMS Chicago Metro Section, please visit www.illinoisapa.org. And on that note, I want to turn it over to our presenters for this afternoon. John.
Okay. Well, thank you. So Gerardo and I are going to kick this off talking about design excellence and project design review in the city of Chicago. Start with some introductions here. Go ahead, Gerardo.
Awesome. Good afternoon, everyone. Gerardo Garcia, Deputy Commissioner with the Bureau of Planning and Design at the City of Chicago's Department of Planning and Development. An architect and urban design by training, and I've been working in government for about 10 years and doing design review pretty intently for about the last 5 of those. John?
Yeah, thanks. John Law, Assistant Commissioner with the department. I'm an urban designer, landscape architect, sustainability professional. I'm actually relatively new to the department here. I've been here for just about a month. I come from a sort of longer private design consulting career. And I'm really focused now on aiding our design excellence efforts and focusing on design review with Gerardo and others in the department. So let's kick it off.
Thanks. So, yep. So, you know, really, as John mentioned, our department has really embraced the concept or the notion of design excellence under this current administration, and for a number of reasons. One, because we feel that our city really has an architectural and design legacy that it's our responsibility to uphold. A little bit more practically, the notion that we want to help the development community really elevate the quality of proposals and thus elevate the experience of the public realm of residents of our city. And you know, more maybe more philosophically, we really see design excellence as a tool for equity, particularly in our neighborhoods. Some of our more recent initiatives, which we'll touch on, are really about focusing economic development in investment outside of our historic downtown core and into our neighborhoods. And we are hopefully leveraging that opportunity to create an environment of design excellence. Next slide, please. And so really our efforts, and when our commissioner arrived at our department about 4 years ago, he asked a very pointed question, and it's really how do we engender a culture that values design excellence in everyday life? And so our design excellence strategy is really centered around this culture question. And we started to try to answer it and define it by creating principles from which to really define design excellence, which, as we all know, can sometimes be perceived as a kind of subjective exercise. So next slide, please. And so we have a set of 10 design excellence principles. You know, our first one, as you can see, is really less about design or aesthetics and more about the process by which we get to development, and being inclusive, and being engaging with our communities in an effort to foster equitable development. So, you know, again, we have 10 of these, just a summary, and for everyone to understand that we've published these, they're out there, and they really do serve as a compass for the design excellence work that we do. So going to also talk a little bit about the current design review process, a quick overview of how that works for us, and where hopefully build into that some of the innovation that we're trying to achieve as a department. So we really see our design excellence programs and initiatives trying to balance two aspects of design review. One is the technical review, and asking the questions of, you know, does a proposal work? Does it meet our zoning regulations, our planning best practices? And on the other end of that is the notion of a qualitative review, and really asking the questions, again, around public realm, around accessibility, and just really at the core of everything, does this proposal make our city better? Does it contribute to the rest of the urban fabric? And within that, obviously, is wrapped up our design excellence principles, and how is the project kind of responding to those? And so, again, this idea that you know, there are many legs of the design review stool, but and all of these forces play a role in really achieving high quality design. And so our role as you know, public servants is to ensure that we're kind of balancing the forces, whether it's our own review, whether it's the priorities of a development proposal, or the priorities of community input, and we're meeting somewhere in the middle to achieve that high quality design, which again is really contributing to the public realm. And so when we look at design review, there's really certain projects that we review. Most critically, plan development. So, and we have specific triggers for these types of projects, whether they're of a certain size or adjacent to a waterfront, et cetera. Our planned manufacturing districts, so our industrial areas, we have 15 of really designated throughout the city, and projects that fall within our lakefront protection boundary, as well as projects that the city is supporting and essentially subsidizing through our TIFs or our other economic incentives, or affordable housing tax credits, for example. And so what we have here is really a rough outline of what our review process looks like, and where kind of design review falls within that, right? And that's early here in our kind of departmental review, along with our zoning review, along with other kind of sister agency reviews. But just really using this to signify, you know, the average amount of time that it'll take a project from the time that an applicant files an application with our city council to the time it gets heard at Plan Commission. We're at about 140 days. And this diagram really, some of those blue and yellow boxes that you see are really showing an applicant action versus kind of our own departmental action. So just trying to illustrate where the onus is on folks throughout the process.
Okay, so thanks, Ferdo. So you've heard a bit about the process. Now I want to talk a little bit about how we're building capacity for design excellence and incorporating that into our design review process. Design excellence really begins with our planning staff. They're the ones on the front line every day, responsible for the implementation and relaying design comments from the department to the applicant teams and architects. And one of the ways that we are enabling and ensuring that we have design excellence throughout all parts of the city is by taking a regional approach. We've divided the city into 7 regions, each with a dedicated team that is focused on that area. Chicago's a big city, lots of unique neighborhoods that have their own challenges and opportunities. And this approach allows the team to become experts in their focus regions. They get to know the context really well. They get to build relationships with aldermen, local developers, and hopefully over time even begin to become a trusted face within the public through the outreach process. Our staff gets to wear a lot of hats, which is exciting and fun for them, I think, for us. Design excellence gets folded into that in many different ways beyond just design review. We consider community engagement an important part of design excellence, for example, by really understanding what the needs of the community are, what the desires are, and to make sure that we can implement that and make that a reality. So beyond engagement and project management, we're also working with our team to develop design excellence through our own mapping exercises, through our own planning initiatives within the department itself. Previously in past years in administrations, much of DPT staff came from, I'll say, a more traditional planning background, experts on zoning, policy, economic development, social impacts, affordable housing. So they're really well equipped for technical review, but perhaps less comfortable with aesthetic or more qualitative design review processes. So that's something we've been focused on recently through this initiative, is by really working with professional development within our own team and making design excellence and design review the process a weekly activity that we invite all staff members to join, so that we have the dialogue in an open forum and develop a vocabulary that all people are comfortable with, so that anyone, whether from a design background or a more conventional planning background, is comfortable speaking with applicant teams about urban form, about materialities, facade design, whatever it is. We want to ensure that common vocabulary. We're also ensuring that each region has someone with a design background to sort of support the graphic needs and the design needs of that team. This is also my reminder to myself to give our shameless plug that we are hiring. So if you happen to be in the Chicago region from a design or planning background and looking to join and work on these exciting projects, we're happy to talk to you. Or perhaps if you're already working for a consulting firm, keep your eyes peeled for something we're hoping to launch later this year, which is sort of a fellowship, a design fellowship, if you will, where we're going to work with local professionals to really develop some fun new design ideas for the city. But we can't do it all ourselves, so we've also gone through processes to work with local consultants. And I think actually, Gerardo, you're going to talk to this if that works.
Yeah, sure. And when we started rolling out Invest Southwest, we'll talk about a little bit more in detail later. We essentially realized that we were allocating resources for new development on the south and west sides of the city. We were going through a process of releasing RFPs for that development, and really wanted to make sure that the development community had the tools that they needed to respond successfully to those RFPs. And so going beyond just the notion of a feasible pro forma to actually bringing designers on board that could achieve design excellence. So we partnered with the Chicago Architecture Center with support from the Pritzker Traubert Foundation to put together an independently juried list of pre-qualified design services firms. And so there are 32 firms Chicago-based on this list that any developer who was responding to an Invest Southwest RFP could go to and to reach out to firms and essentially engage in putting together these RFPs. What we found actually is that as the development community has seen the value of this list through the RFP process, more and more developers are just using it as a resource to find design services firms. And so it was published with the intent of being a 3-year document. And so within the next year, we will be, through partnership again, reconvening a jury to and making a call for a new updated pre-qualified list of firms.
Okay, cool. So in addition to our in-house and consultant design review process and consultant teams, we're also turning to outside experts to enhance our design review process through the Committee on Design. This is a fun, exciting new initiative that is just less than a year old, just launched last year, so it's still an evolving process. And it's taking cues from other large cities like Boston, Seattle, New York, Toronto, that all have expert design review panels, but this is a first for Chicago. The Committee on Design is an advisory group to the department that meets once a month to review and critique a handful of projects each month based on the aesthetic proposed development to ensure that the projects have a positive impact on the city's public realm. And the goal here is to create a more thoughtful and hopefully speedier review process, while also sort of encouraging and upholding Chicago's tradition for innovative architecture and design. So that's sort of one of the underlying goals, but it's also about creating transparency and understanding in a public forum what our design and review process is, what the criteria are that we look at when we get a development. So we're not working behind closed doors. We want to be open and clear about these things that we value in our developments. And bringing that to a public forum, we think is a great way to also educate aldermen, the public, anyone that's interested in what urban design issues are and what they look like. And as I'll talk about in a little bit, this also is intended not to be an extra hurdle for applicants to go through, but really a way to expedite the review process. So we've got a great team, 24 volunteer members, seasoned design professionals that are all based in Chicago, so they have a really great understanding of local context. It's a really well-established group, very diverse both demographically and by industry. We have architects, urban designers, landscape architects, we have artists, community organizers, educators, and even developers, a couple developers that have expertise in both market rate and affordable housing. And this variety of background means that these aren't lofty or academic discussions around, sort of objective design values, but the committee understands the challenges that developers face around social issues, financing, construction. And so the goal here is to offer what we think is very invaluable, but implementable and realistic recommendations that impact neighborhood vitality, livability, affordability, and hopefully in the long run is going to help us build a better Chicago for everyone. So this is, thinking back to the diagram that Harda shared earlier, this is our revised review process with Committee on Design in place. It's a voluntary process. No one's forced to go through the COD. But we're beginning to see the benefits of the projects that have gone through this, both from just an overall quality standpoint, but in terms of timeline and expediting the process as well. So by shifting the COD early in the process, we're able to sort of get the ideas out there early, that the obstacles and the sort of challenges that we see from a design standpoint and a city building standpoint, to air those early and address them in a more expeditious way. So we're avoiding sort of multiple rounds of review with the department. And relying on our experts to help us determine what the key issues are. And in doing so, that's actually helping us save upwards of 2 months off the overall process. Another thing we've begun to offer is what we're calling the concept review stage, shown as the sort of 0-0 mark here. And we're inviting teams that are interested to go through this process to actually come to us and have a more informal discussion about what their aspirations are for their project, what the department and city concerns might be, public concerns, in a way that gets the ball rolling, and we can sort of address some of these issues early on before they even begin the formal review process. Initially, we planned to sort of focus the COD on some key projects, Committee on Design. Chicago has a series of mega projects, as we call them, very large in scale and scope. So those would certainly go through the process. Also looking at super tall buildings, of which we have many in the city, of course. But also looking at projects that would go through our normal PD review process that rely on city initiatives, city incentives rather, and projects that are located in key commercial corridors and some of our rapidly developing neighborhoods. Which actually brings us to an interesting case study in Fulton Market. This is actually the first project that went through the Committee on Design. We had a very prominent design team and developer team that was proposing the building you see there on the left. And after some rounds of review with the department, we sort of came to a bit of a standstill and a slight disagreement on how the building should be responding to the West of Design guidelines in terms of setback and building form. So at which point we actually engaged the Committee on Design and went through a more robust design discussion in this forum. And through that process, many of the expert design reviewers were able to weigh in and share their thoughts, have a very productive discussion. And in the end, we ended up, we think, with a result that didn't dramatically change the overall design or look of the building, but did enough to respond to the urban design guidelines and massing setbacks to better respond to local context, improve some sun and shadow studies, and make the open space more accessible and meaningful. But even actually, in the surprising development, through the discussion with COD, someone raised a suggestion to actually bury the parking and pull it out of the podium and put it below grade, which is of course a significant investment on the developer side, but they were actually happy to engage in that process, which was great. Another more recent project, a really interesting site on the south side of Chicago, adjacent to the Green Line. This project had a very high affordable housing component to it, but the site was a bit constrained both in height and density restrictions under the current zoning. So by going through the committee on design and some back and forth with the alderman and the department, we took what began as a sort of design that was struggling with fitting the volume into the site and starting to shape the building through these processes and the committee suggestions, and what we think came out to be a pretty handsome looking development. It could be a really impactful project on the south side. So that's a bit about process and how we approach design excellence. We also want to share a couple of recent initiatives that we've done so you can see how we're actually putting this into action. The first one are our neighborhood design guidelines, and this falls under the category that we call, or I like to call, proactive design review. So rather than waiting for developments to come across our desks that perhaps aren't achieving what we'd hope to see, we want to get out in front of the process and be more proactive in how we communicate what the city wants to see in terms of best practices in urban design. For many developers, this might be common sense, but there's enough people out there that benefit from this in the development design teams that can benefit from these guidelines. But they're also intended to be used by the public, by aldermen, that maybe there's a development coming up in their neighborhood and they question if it's doing the right things, the right moves, and they can refer to these guidelines as a way to understand what we value as urban and city planners. So this actually sort of spawned from a design excellence working group that we have, which is another group of volunteer local professionals, and they helped us to craft those 10 design excellence principles that Gerardo referred to earlier on. And from that, we sort of started to shape those and put some more physical design implications to these principles and offer these draft guidelines, which have then just recently been approved by the Chicago Plan Commission this past month. So we're now able to refer to these as a tool that we can use in our design review process and point to the aspirations here. Again, this set of guidelines is focused on commercial infill, neighborhood commercial corridors rather. And we want to be clear that they're not trying to impose architectural styles, and that they're really focused on the parcel itself, not necessarily adjacent streetscape or open space, more how they interface with the public realm. They also don't override existing guidelines that might exist in certain neighborhoods or specific to certain topics. The guidelines are structured around 6 categories and topics, shown here. Sustainability, with the thought that design has a positive long-term environmental, socio-cultural, and human health impacts and how we can address those. Program, looking at targeted uses that complement the development surrounding context. Site design, concerning things like building orientation, layout, open space, parking and service. Public realm, so that improvements within and near the public right of way and adjacent to the development site, understanding that interface and how the building meets the street. Looking at massing, aspects like bulk, height, form, and how that relates to the context and is sensitive to surrounding development. And finally, facade, looking at architectural expression, material selection on the building's exterior, both at the ground level and higher up in the building. Then you can see sort of a sample page from that outlines the category, the various topics, and the specific guidelines that we use to evaluate and critique projects. You can see that we're not offering a lot of very specific hardcore or hard and fast rules, but using analogy images and descriptive aspects that leave some room for interpretation and allow for maximum flexibility regardless of scale or type of project. And we see this proactive communication as part of an emerging series. So we began with neighborhood design guidelines because they're an important part of what we do. But we want to expand this series and these guidelines into looking at things like commercial storefronts, downtown high-rise development, even residential infill, and eventually industrial design guidelines as well, which is an important part of our city building. Gerardo, back to you.
Yep. So going to talk a little bit of Invest Southwest, as I've mentioned, we mentioned a couple times earlier, but we really see this as another way of how we're enacting our design excellence strategy and our design excellence principles. And if we go to the next slide, really the core theme of Invest Southwest is finding ways to encourage economic development on the south and west sides of the city, which have historically been underinvested. And our mayor here at the launch of Invest Southwest a couple of years ago, we took this quote from her statements where, the issue isn't a lack of government funding in these communities, but it's actually a lack of multiplying public investment with private investment. And that's something that Invest Southwest has really sought to change since the launch of the program in 10 community areas on the south and west sides of the city. Next slide, please. And the way that we went about thinking about doing that was really taking in this central kind of tranche of investments about $500 million of investments that were already planned and infrastructure improvements that were planned or underway, and really sitting down with our sister agencies and partner departments and ensuring that those investments were coordinated in a way that would yield or encourage or support private development. In addition to that, moving down to the bottom here, our department allocated from our TIFs and our Neighborhood Opportunity Fund about another $250 million. And then we basically set a goal of $250 million for additional investment to really make this a billion-dollar program, if you will. Next slide. And what we saw was actually what we feel is a series of catalytic investments driven by the city, but really focused on private sector development with 10 mixed-use, mixed-income developments across the south and west sides, totaling over $300 million that we essentially encourage through an RFP process. Some of these are on city land, some are on privately owned land, but all of these have some level or a significant level of city subsidy, I should say. Next slide, please. And so why would we do an RFP strategy for Invest Southwest, and why was that kind of critical in achieving design excellence? And I think this next series of slides attempts to really answer those questions. And so really the RFP strategy for us became an exercise for visioning and visioning along with a community and taking the inputs from that community process and framing them around design excellence, around the realities of what the markets in these communities can bear. And it actually allowed us as a city, and again, along with the various communities that we were engaging with, to really set the bar and an expectation for what we were expecting from these development proposals. So the rendering that you see here was actually produced by Perkins and Will through the Chicago Central Area Community Committee on a pro bono basis. And this was the rendering that was issued in the RFP to illustrate the type and level of development that we wanted to see as part of this process. Next slide. And it also drove competition. And so by driving competitions, we were able to receive multiple responses, and essentially in communities that, again, were for decades invested, all of a sudden we were able to have conversations around options and choosing and what's the best solution and the best development for the community. And what you see on the screen here are 4 different proposals for the same site in Englewood here in Chicago. Next slide, please. We also use the RFP as a way to create a level of transparency. And so we really redefine what a community engagement process looks like through the RFP process. And so what you see on the screen is actually a development team presenting to a roundtable of community stakeholders virtually, because again, we did all of this through the pandemic. And community members were actually able to ask questions, to hear directly from the development teams, but also eventually participate on the evaluation committee for selecting the winning proposal. Next slide, please. And we also saw the RFP process as a way to really think through site selection. Many of these corridors have a lot of vacant parcels that are city-owned or government-controlled in some way. There's also vacancy in terms of existing building stock. And so doing the RFP process allowed us to prioritize alongside with the community where to start. And where to start, usually there was a conversation around what's going to be the most catalytic, what's going to yield more development and more investment. And so what you see on the screen is actually the site plan for the Inglewood site. And as you can see, there are 3 packages of sites here. And in this case, there's a much larger corridor, but the community said, we want to finish the job here. There was a Whole Foods built during the last administration in a kind of suburban style shopping center. And the community said, we want to finish this job. We want to see the rest of this site developed. And so that's essentially what we did. And because it is a very large site, we gave developers the option to select where they thought on this site they could propose a more feasible development. Next slide. And again, part of the strategy was very critical for us to really set an expectation of what we as a city and the community would be evaluating proposals against. And so what you see on the screen are a series of renderings for the different sites of Invest Southwest created pro bono by all of these firms that you see on the screen here through a community visioning process. And, you know, obviously design excellence was a key priority here, but just as key was feasibility and knowing that everything that we showed as a development proposal or as a development vision could be achieved financially and was all around feasible. Next slide, please. And what we saw was the development community respond in kind. And so here are RFP responses from the development community, essentially. So you can start to see almost one-to-one how in unique ways and achieving through different aesthetics, these proposals start to achieve the principles and concepts that we outlined in the RFP. So open space, accessibility, high quality materials, et cetera. All of these things started to be responded to through the process. So John, do you want to wrap us up with the key takeaways here?
Sure. So just sort of through that discussion, I think it sort of boils down for us for three key takeaways in terms of design review. The first one is that there's a benefit to using proactive design review, the old adage that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and we're starting to see that through our design guideline and the sort of RFP process. Putting these visions out there early allows for a shorter and more condensed, more productive design review timeline down the road. The second is that design review is all about managing expectations for all the stakeholders, the developers, the public, the aldermen, the design team, the mayor's office. A lot of people are involved with these processes. A lot of people want to see them go through, but we want to make sure that they're beneficial to everybody while still meeting, the bottom line that's necessary to make them viable. And lastly, is that design excellence is for everyone. Affordability shouldn't negate good design. We want to ensure that design excellence is enhancing all of our communities, that we're not focusing on areas that are doing well and sort of ignoring communities that have been traditionally underprivileged. So design excellence doesn't mean more expensive necessarily. We want to find ways to enhance the urban environment for all Chicagoans. So that's a bit how we approach design review at the city. I think we're going to turn it over to Jeff now, if that's right.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
All right, can everyone see the screen? Yes, I think so. All right, so Jeff Brady with the Village of Glenview, Director of Community Development. Glenview is located a couple miles north of the city of Chicago. So going to go over a couple different items here today. So a little bit about the design review process, have a couple case studies that we can take a look at, and then kind of explain what Glenview is continuing to work on to basically answer any of the questions with respect to design review. So we're going to talk about the design review process. So here we have 4 design review principles. Basically, it's a partnership to come to the community character that's desired, a partnership between both the property owners and the village. There's a lot of communication that is involved. You ultimately have to set the standards and then effectively communicate those standards. And then as you're going through the process, you're looking to guide the applicant through that process to make sure that there's a competent proposal that's ultimately submitted for the review and ultimately something that can be constructed. And then it's all about establishing those expectations, setting the bar high. It's what makes our spaces places where people want to live, work, and play. So Glenview is part of the design review process. For a long time, it was set up with 3 different commissions. You have our Plan Commission, our Zoning Board of Appeals, and our Appearance Commission. Our Appearance Commission is one of the first appearance commissions in the country. It was set up back in 1969. And you can see from the screen on the right-hand side there, during the 2020 time period, there was a significant amount of cases that were coming through all of our commissions, primarily through our Appearance Commission. We're structured in such a way where our commission reviews the items. Some of them are final approvals granted by the commission. Other opportunities are recommendations that go on to our village board for final approval. One of the things that's always very important is knowing your audience and how you're communicating with them. Each group is coming at it from a different perspective. So your architect, engineer, the details are very important. Residents are probably very unfamiliar with the process, and change is a bad mindset. So you have a lot of different actors as part of the process, and explaining it from each of their perspectives is really important in understanding and ensuring that there's a good design review process. One of the ways that the Village of Glenview has worked on this is it's oftentimes very complicated. You know, you kind of need the elevator speech. What's one sheet that is a takeaway that you can give to anyone who's looking to go through the process? We created this chutes and ladders example here. So you go through each of the various steps. If you don't make it through a step, you might slide back to, and go backwards and then start over again. But ultimately, we've laid out the process in a very simple manner with a very relatable time frame and schedule. The goal with that schedule is to, has been discussed previously, is to kind of front load all of the requirements and standards so that it's obvious what standards that you have to meet to easily get a project through. We're doing that in a visual manner with these design guidelines. Do this, don't do that, thumbs up, yes, no. Ultimately, if you meet the standards, the commission has a high likelihood of approving anything that's coming through. And ultimately, this process is to answer the question that you commonly get: what does the village want to see with respect to a particular project that's being proposed? Another way that we're kind of communicating on a different level is we created basically an educational series. We drafted a bunch of YouTube videos in very short and brief segments for short attention spans. You can go to any one of the chapters, find out a lot more about the process, why you have to go through the process. This helped, rather than recording something for staff to just relay to any of the applicants, this is an easy way to find out the information that you need to know, at whatever time frame is convenient to you. And the goal is that with all of these resources, you have the video, you have staff as a resource, you have our village website to find out all this type of information. With the design guidelines, our zoning ordinance, and then the staff and appearance commission, the goal for all of our design review is making great looking places. So I want to go through some of the case studies here. We had a major case study that was done. This is the Glenview Naval Air Station redevelopment project. It was a master plan and design guidelines process. This began in the mid-1990s. Ultimately, as part of this process, you can see on the left-hand side here, it involved a 1,200-acre naval air station base. So all of the World War II training cadets, everybody came through the Glenview Naval Air Station as part of their training. And as part of the DoD's selling of some of their assets, the village was able to have this opportunity to basically look at ways to incorporate what is ultimately a third of the square footage of the village that is located in the middle or center of the village into the neighboring communities and create basically a very significant development with a lot of characteristics, rooms, if you will, as they were described. And so on the right-hand side, you see the resulting product from going through that process. And that process included working with a consultant. We had Skidmore, Owens & Merrill, who helped us out in creating a master plan and design guidelines for the entire 1,200-acre redevelopment. The categories and the chapters are listed on the screen. I'm going to focus on a couple of different areas and also focus on the process that we were using on how we used those design guidelines, which basically were a precursor to the current form-based codes that you see throughout the country. So remember, we had 3 commissions. We had our Plan Commission, Appearance Commission, and Zoning Board of Appeals. We created a super commission. Why have the applicants go through 3 different processes? Why not combine it, have everything discussed at once? So we created this Glen Redevelopment Commission. It was very effective. Ultimately, over the 6 years, there was 127 cases, over $1 billion of investment, and this project won a ULI Award for Excellence in 2013. Ultimately, what was very interesting about this process is that you had each of these commissions were in their various silos, and now they're all working together. So we did have to work through situations where certain groups were, you're not paying enough attention to this subject matter or that subject matter compared to the way they would do it, or you would have personalities where they would begin to talk about their particular pet peeves as part of the overall design components. But again, we were trying to use the master plan and the design guidelines to kind of feather through what was necessary as part of the overall design for each of the developments that came about. This is a picture of the Glen Town Center, which I'll be talking about in a couple minutes. So the result of these design guidelines is that, again, throughout this 1,200-acre site, we got a lot of unique architectural features throughout the town center. So we have some senior developments, office, commercial areas. On the right-hand side, that's a fairly prominent education campus for the Cold Chisholm Museum. From the standpoint of the design, again, these are kind of the precursors to the form-based code. We had guidelines on how to go about doing development for our moderate density residential. We had material examples, what type of roof forms. We had examples of how you can lay out the buildings with setbacks and what type of design elements, how to potentially do any alley conditions or detached garages. We had some visual examples with representative architectural styles of character that would need to be replicated to be successful. We had developers that were going through, this happens to be a suburban urbanism example of a developer doing some small lot configurations with 2 flats and smaller lot single family homes, duplexes with very creative and urban type of architecture. On the upper left hand, you see the rendering, and the other pictures are the actual products that were built. Again, all based upon the guidance that was provided from the design guidelines. Wanted to focus on the Hangar 1. So again, this was a working naval air station for many, many years. On the left-hand side, you can see historical pictures of the Hangar 1, which is the main and primary hangar. You can see the tarmac. You can see the building under construction, and then ultimately its adaptive reuse. We had mixed-use retail center guidelines, and again, for the mid and late 90s, this was fairly progressive as far as highlighting the building placement, orientation of the street, how you would go about doing building heights, building setbacks, architecture, how you would work with the kind of international style of the existing hangars that were being adaptively reused, and bring that into a component of architecture for a town center concept. And in this version, you see the town center concept. Everything was oriented around this center hangar 1 area. So that's where everything is oriented. All of the street components, they're on an angle. So anytime you're walking, it doesn't seem like it's a long walk. You're always looking at the hangar and the tower, the control tower. So it's very pedestrian friendly. The big boxes are on one side of the street that are lined through pedestrian scaled retail buildings. That's also where the parking decks and parking garages are located. And then on the other side of the street, again, all centered around the hangar building, you have the mixed use buildings with ground floor retail and then 2 levels apartments above that. And then it's bookended by more urban type of development in kind of these commons areas, if you will. All of these are kind of tuck under 4-story townhouses that evoke a very Lincoln Park in Chicago type of feel. So here are just some examples of, again, how those design guidelines were used to evoke the type of architecture. You can see in the bottom slide here with the pictures, this was our way of kind of addressing the international style of architecture that you see around the hangar 1, the control tower section. Very pedestrian friendly, very activating from the standpoint of families, the walkability, opportunities for outdoor dining and festivals and activities to close off the street. And then this is the tower crossing example. These are the more urban type of townhouses that were created, more compact, again, very Lincoln Park-like, that have this common feel, but is always associated with the convenience of being close to the town center. One of the other interesting things that we did in a partnership in working with the developer is making sure that we were promoting the high quality design that was desired for this town center concept. And ultimately, it resulted in a very streamlined approach. You meet the locations of the proposed signage, awnings, facade, any of the lighting components on how each one of the tenants might have spruced up their boxes, if you will, that they were using for their tenant space facades. If you comply with the requirements, ultimately you get a permit. It's been very successful over the 20+ years that we've been doing this administrative approval process. There's really only been one time that there was a public complaint about the results of the architecture that came about from the process. Some of the examples of the tenant criteria that we use are examples for different types of blade signs that you could do, how you can go ahead and incorporate each of your storefronts, how you should orient your square footage of signage or graphics on your awning, the types of colors, the fabric types of colors, the Sunbrella fabric colors that are permitted throughout the town center to be used in each of the tenant spaces. Here are some of the results. There was very interesting opportunities to have that pedestrian scale with both the vehicle and pedestrian signage that you see in the middle. On the left-hand side, we were trying to, again, be very proactive in the creative opportunities. You have channel letter signs, but you still have the opportunity to kind of do exposed neon look. And then on the right-hand side, really great opportunities to do various types of blade signs, cutout and stencil cuts, using lighting in a different manner. And in this instance, the awnings are kind of replicating that of the naval theme that you have with the airplane wing. Here's some more examples of some of the creative blade signs. And then we were also looking to accentuate the various canopies and overhangs that were throughout the entire town center by kind of mounting the raceways on top of that and then hiding all of the mechanicals behind that. So it was kind of a seamless look for all of the signage that was proposed for the town center. Again, all of this is through the use of the design guidelines and the tenant criteria to get these facades. Here's a case study for our downtown. We, in 2008, approved one of the form-based codes in the Chicagoland area for our downtown Glenview area. A lot of focus and emphasis on good building form and required design elements as part of this code. Some of the design standards that we had, again, were wireframe examples showing different ways of doing fenestration, had examples of architecture. It's always easier to be an editor than a creator, so we were prescribing the type of character that was desired in any of the building types. You know, there needs to be a base, middle, and top in your building design. We also showed the various features when you're looking at, again, that base, middle, what type of building materials, what type of roof forms made some sense. As part of the process in going through any of the design review, we always referenced a montage of the character of the downtown area. This is some of the building types that you see with the materials and the architecture that you would see in the downtown. We would relay all this information to any of the developers and then the applicants. Want to go through one applicant experience. This was the redevelopment of basically a block of the downtown Glenview, which is pretty significant. When they were starting, they looked at all of our form-based code, all the design standards. They started this exercise of what are the palette of types of features that you would see in an apartment building. Ultimately, it came out in some of their first forays into the design, flat roofs, you know, kind of boxy architecture, a little bit more contemporary than what Glenview would like. There's also a lot of iconic debates, if you will. Some of the debates included what type of roof styles you should do. So on this end cap, this has a kind of a gable roof over the end cap. What would it look like if you had a flat roof concept, as you see on the right-hand side? This was the same type of discussion on some corner elements. This was at the intersection of two streets. Do you do it in more of a flat roof style, as you see on the left-hand side, or more of a traditional style on that corner element, adding in some more gable elements to kind of break up the roof style on the right-hand side? Ultimately, this was the final design that was approved, and it was very successful in its implementation. When you see the final finished product, looks basically like the rendering. One of the things that you always have the opportunity to do is go through continuing education. So we're always trying to improve the process. From the developer's perspective, the process in going through the design review using our form-based code was such that there might have been a little bit too much reliance on our form-based code, some of the design standards. You can't ultimately just rely on those so that they would predict architecture that's going to work. Sometimes the standards that you put in place could be a little bit limiting. Also, when you're going through these designs, make sure that your architects, you know, while they might be trying to please the community from the design aspects on the outside, like through their SketchUp designs or renderings and things of that nature, make sure that their interior units lay out. Ultimately, what happened in some instances is that they made sure that the outside looked very good, but when they tried to figure out how their interior units would lay out, it didn't match with the architecture that was ultimately preferred. And then anytime you're going through any of these design review opportunities, especially if there's a subjective nature such as commission input, these diverse opinions can always lead to a better product. You know, the more discussion, the better, and the more improved the outcome would be. But make sure that you're reaching some sort of consensus, because if you're pleasing a bunch of individuals, you can sometimes get that Frankenstein effect where you don't have a cohesive building design. You have elements that are meeting each of the objectives of the reviewers at the time, but ultimately don't result in a cohesive design product. One of the things that we worked on as part of some of the experiences is to kind of change the narrative of how we're going through these things. So especially in some of the new apartment developments that we're seeing in our downtown area using our form-based code, you're seeing kind of this homogeneous apartment design. It's referenced as such as the Mine Craftsman type of style or contemporary contempt. So you just have to go through and really understand why some of these things are happening. Obviously, there's a cost involved for the stick-built nature of some apartments and some of the ease and use of the materials. Also, some of the blocky design, again, just works really well with laying out the interior units. But the other thing that happens is that this contemporary design with the clean lines on the outside projects the tranquil and carefree living that happens on the inside. So they're selling a product. So that's a a lot of the reasons why you're seeing the architecture, and not all times does that architecture really work with the character that's desired by our community. So just realize that the objectives are the same to make sure that you're achieving a product that everyone can be proud of. And ultimately, there's always options to modify the design to be representative of the community character with just making changes here or there. An example here is that these are kind of the designs that you're seeing representative of that homogeneous effect with the architecture. They all kind of look the same. They're just dressed up a little bit differently with the materials, and they have some undulation in them. Again, some of these could be more contemporary with glass and steel and metal panels, but ultimately you're seeing a lot of the same things. What we were trying to look at with our downtown is that there was a lot of conversation of how can you have this traditional look in this version of very contemporary modern type of apartment design. So using the example of the Fulton Market, which is in the city of Chicago, and kind of their loft warehouse type of conversion, you have very traditional buildings, but ultimately they have a lot of contemporary designs in them. So we looked and provided a bunch of examples of either existing buildings or proposed developments in the Fulton Market area that were representative of that very downtown community characteristics, and that ultimately working with the developer, we came up with a design that wasn't cookie cutter, that did evoke kind of that traditional feel with the types of materials that you would see in some of those warehouse buildings that have been converted, have a lot of traditional materials and characteristics that you would see in the downtown Glenview area that were evoked in these building designs. Want to go through another case study. This is how we're using our design guidelines relative to some of the tenant spaces. This example includes that Midtown Square development that I was reviewing earlier. This is an opportunity to kind of build out a particular tenant space. The design here, or the idea, was to evoke kind of the old-time butcher shop. You see an example of what that would look like on the right-hand side. And the way that we went about doing this is using our design guidelines with some of the sign opportunities, whether it's wall signs or different ways of doing the push-through graphics or stencil cut box signs, halo illumination. How can you use your tenant panels and your facade to basically make it your own? We worked with the applicant on some design progressions. We had some first and second tries, which you see on the screen, ultimately getting into a component of trying to figure out how much signage was consistent. One of the things you always have to be aware of is that there's just a very subtle difference between the aesthetics and of a facade compared to using those aesthetics as advertisement. So when we're looking through our design guidelines, we have a code requirement, so that's the maximum you can do. But in general, we use the design guidelines because the design guidelines represent about 80% of the things that are easily accepted by any of our design review commissions. And so if you're presenting something in light of the design guidelines, you're going to have a very quick process to getting any permits approved. Having said that, from the applicant's perspective, they're always looking at bigger is better and what's the biggest type of thing that I can get onto my facade. So this is an example of that difference between what the design guidelines would say, what our appearance code or zoning code would be as your maximum, as well as what an applicant might expect to have for their site. And here's ultimately the final product. This ended up being a little bit above the design guideline percentages for signage, but below the zoning code. And then with the panels and the gooseneck fixtures, it does really evoke kind of that feeling that they were going for the old-timey butcher shop. And the picture of the inside of the building is on the right-hand side there. So just to wrap up here, one of the things that we always got to be on the lookout is we have to keep updating the answers. So as is the case in design review, most people in doing it are very much better at being editors than they are at being creators. So it's our job to basically give the applicants the answers so that they can pass this test. So we're continuing to work here at the Village of Glenview on answering that question of what does the village want to see? So some of the things that we're continuing to work on is we've recently updated that form-based code. We have an even more extensive focus on what's happening with our review design standards. An example of those instances are incorporation of kind of these step backs. How can you have better undulation and you don't just have one massive facade that's going across a block? How can you have a lot of different facade articulation and doing it in multiple different ways and combinations of those ways? We also updated that form-based code pattern book, so we included a lot more examples of acceptable facades, recessed entries, projections, and the types of architectural details that would be expected in the community's character for a finalized project. We also have been consolidating kind of the silos that you had with our various commissions. Again, we had the Appearance, Plan, and Zoning Board of Appeals. What we created is we created a new Development Commission and a Development Adjustments Commission. And what's very unique about this scenario with this commission consolidation efforts is that both of these commissions, they have the same development review authority. So no matter which commission you go through, each of them can do everything that's necessary to do any sort of development approvals. Having said that, and practically speaking, what we do is we send any of the new developments, so any of the public hearings, rezonings, massive developments, text amendments, any of those types of things that would require a public hearing or would be high profile, those go through the new development commission. More of the nuanced, the design review items, some of the smaller details, single family zoning variations, some commercial conditional uses that might be minor. Those all would go through the Development Adjustments Commission. Having said that, if one of the commissions gets backed up, we can send those cases that would normally have gone through that commission, practically speaking, we can send them through the other commission, and it's becoming very efficient for us in managing our caseloads and getting any of our applicants through the design review and development review process. And then lastly, what we're doing is we are updating our design guidelines. It's been some time since we updated them. So we're having these development design guidebooks. It includes everything from single tenant, multi-tenant ground signs, the facades, lighting, parking, commercial corridors. And here's a way again that we're just relaying what's thumbs up as far as you're hitting the design components that's necessary to get through the process, whether it's administratively or whether it's through one of our commissions. And then those things that you should not emulate, again, just setting that high bar of standards so that we can get good design out of our developments. And so looking back at the village's plan for appearance back in the 1969 here, everything that we're seeing is really still relevant today, and maybe even more so as there's such a high value for good design with the populace craving this authenticity and then the experience that they're looking for. Design is a major component of making sure that those places are great places to be. And just make sure you're keeping your character checklists updated and that you have a prescriptive design standards for your community to basically inspire the imagination that's necessary to achieve good design and the vision of that good design from your community's perspective. And with that, thank you very much. And I think it's time for questions.
Wonderful. If everyone would like to throw their webcams back on to my fellow panelists, we'll kick things off here. And actually, this first question is going to be for Tom, if you're still hanging around. Are you back there somewhere? You might have gone away. I can, oh, yep, there he is. Hey, the first question that came in is for you, Tom. Does MDRN have any sample RFPs for hiring a consultant to help creating design guidelines, or a list of consultants or firms that we could send an RFP to? This is someone coming from suburban Chicago.
Boy, so I know the Chaddick Institute through DePaul has some sample like sign codes or design guidelines through their web page, but I don't believe we have RFP information. I can double check on that, but off the top of my head, I don't think we do, unfortunately. Yeah, but I can double check.
Okay, thank you. And you'll be able to see in the post report, Tom, who asked that and follow up with them.
Okay.
Okay, so this first one is for John and Gerardo. Do your design guidelines require minimum landscaping and green landscaping, not counting hardscaping, to be provided?
I can chime in here. Our guidelines really try to be much less prescriptive and principle based, and we rely really on our zoning code and our landscape ordinance for those requirements around landscaping. What we find with that is it allows us flexibility to have conversations with applicants around additional landscaping and what makes sense just based on the principled approach and what we're trying to achieve. So I guess the answer is yes, we have requirements that we can rely on, but ultimately not at the expense of having conversations to kind of to Jeff's point in his presentation, like find the right solution for the context.
And I'll just build on that a little bit too. I think they sort of work a little bit in tandem, right? You have this sort of more regulatory prescriptive requirements that set minimum provisions for mono open space, type of open space. But the guidelines essentially allow us to open up the conversation more to the qualitative aspects. What should that landscape be? Is it just going to be trees and sod, or is it going to be something that's more interactive that allows for community uses? So working with both of those factors, I think, is really an important part of the success.
Okay, thank you. This one here is for Jeff. What ended up being the substantive design guidelines themselves developed? The public engagement consulting group working with the village officials. Can you talk a little bit more about how that worked?
Sure. Yeah, it was all of that. So staff kind of laid out the framework. We on occasion have worked with design consultants to put a lot of this information together, not only from their experiences, but just regionally. You know, staff goes out and takes pictures and experiences different places. What would evoke the same type of characteristics in another town that we would see in the Glenview area. And then ultimately, there has been public review as part of any of these design guidelines. It goes through a review by our commissions. They are kind of analyzing to make sure that the design criteria not only evokes the characteristics that are desired, but are representative of the types of projects that they would ultimately approve. And so once that process is done, we have a set of, again, prescriptive standards that any of the applicants can use so that they're kind of ahead of the game. They're not starting from zero. They're starting from, you know, a standpoint of hopefully it's one and done.
Okay, thank you. There was another question about they really loved the design guidelines. The graphics were great, and they want to know how they can access them. I assume I am just now in the Village of Glenview's websites under your ordinances and codes, and I see some. Is that where we should be directing folks to get a copy of them?
Yep, that's the location where those items are currently housed.
Okay, perfect. Okay, next question is, let's see. Let's jump back to John and Gerardo. For the public involvement and the RFP review, how long does that process take?
So it varies, but and the reason why it varies is the visioning portion of the work, right? So getting from the moment that we kicked off until the moment that we issued RFP, for all of those was about 8 weeks. And within those 8 weeks, there were at least one, maybe two, maybe three kind of engagements, depending on the community. So, and that really helped to form the vision for the RFP. then after, after an RFP respondent was selected, there was about another 3-month period where for evaluation of the proposals, but also where we were engaging with residents and bringing them on board into the evaluation committee. Now, of that 3-month period, obviously it's not all engagement, but there are a couple touch points in there, and then maybe an intense 2-week period of actual review and deliberation of the proposals with community evaluators.
Okay. Thank you. Are the City of Chicago's 10 principles available online somewhere? And where can we go to find them?
Yeah, they're on the city's website. I'll maybe throw a link in the chat for the
Please.
Design Excellence landing page.
Great. Thank you. Back to you, Jeff. How often does Glenview update design guidelines, and what is the impetus for updating them?
So we're continually updating them. Some of the larger refreshes, there's like 10 years between the refreshes that are occurring. The easiest way is that as some of these items end up going through our commissions and the comments that are relayed, once the kind of opinions or the character is changing based upon what is, what is relevant in some of the design. So for instance, there's always improvements in signage technology or different ways of addressing in the more modern area what a facade might look like. So as we're seeing our design guidelines kind of get out of touch with what's happening, or we're seeing more types of approvals that aren't necessarily compatible with our design guidelines, but are more than acceptable for the types of characteristics in design that we're looking for. Those are really the reasons for doing those updates. And things are changing so fast these days, especially with the types of materials that are out there. What is good design, and then what is kind of common in the marketplace. As I was mentioning with the apartment designs, they don't build them like they used to, and so you kind of have to adapt quickly to some of those changes so that you ensure your character is matching the vision of the community.
Okay, thank you. And Jeff, what is Minecraftsman style? Could you explain that phrase, I guess? Minecraftsman style?
The Twitterverse, these are just the ways to describe kind of the homogeneous architecture that's coming out about with some of these developments. So, someone's taken a purposeful hit on someone's design characteristics for some developments that they're seeing. But yeah, Minecraft is the game that all the kids are playing, and they're kind of designing their old worlds, and that it's very boxy, and it's not really representative of pedestrian, or sometimes they can be very monolithic, and that very stark because they're reusing a lot of their designs, which is kind of what you would see in the Minecraft verse. And I think along those lines with these design guidelines, one of the challenges that you always have is that you need to box, the standards have to be boxed in such a way where there's still flexibility to have that creativity and that variety. You don't want everything to look the same. So you need that box has to be small enough so that it's representative of your community characteristics, but it can't be so small that you only get one product type in one design with no variety. That's also not good for the ultimate health and sense of place that you are looking to find in your corridors and in your districts.
Jeff, I'll add that Minecraftsmanship is not a phenomenon limited to suburban environment. Unfortunately, we see plenty of that on our end too. So, and I think that what the balance you just alluded to, I think is something that we also debate and struggle with a little bit too, in terms of there are certain neighborhoods and areas of Chicago that have a very unique style, if you will, and we want to be able to allow for that to be reinforced and done in a more contemporary way with current practices. But it's hard to do that in the city, at least across the entire region, right, or across the entire city property, given the differences you see within neighborhoods. So, you know, it's a balance that we also work with, and I think that's why you can see in our guidelines we skewed to a more using reference images versus diagrams, for example, to allow for more you know, subjective review from the team.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that you see is that, again, people have a much better time being an editor of something than being a creator. So the more examples that kind of are representative of the box of things that you're looking for, the better off you are, especially when a lot of the design review professionals that you have on here. And the reason for these design reviews is that you want people that can, you know, they know what they're talking about, and they can understand the various trends that are going on, the material types, how design works. And when you have a lot of design professionals on your commissions to kind of review these things, one of the challenges can be is that you need the design guidelines to kind of reestablish those characteristics, because many of the architects will be perfectly fine with, you know, multiple different aesthetics. And so, you know, they might not have a problem with some of the more contemporary designs or an all steel and glass building because they like it as part of their design profession, but does it really fit within the characteristics of your community, your neighborhood, you know, the district, the corridor that you're looking to replicate?
Okay, thank you. This next question is for any of our panelists, and I am going to add a second part to this question at the end of it. But the specific question here says, how do your design guidelines address public safety and crime concerns? And then I am going to add a second piece to this and also ask that you discuss how any of your design guidelines, if they do, address special populations, for example, the elderly, or APA has a new interest group, and there's I think it's a PAS memo regarding design guidelines and the relationship with autistic community members. So if you could talk about the special populations that you take into consideration with design guidelines, and then also how you address public safety / crime concerns. And anyone want to take a stab at this first?
I can certainly chime in on the first question. Particularly for the neighborhood design guidelines, we were working on these summer 2020, spring 2020, and it was right around the time that we had a lot of social unrest around the country. You know, there was particularly in our downtown, you know, a lot of storefronts being damaged, et cetera. And so we kind of struggled with to what extent to acknowledge that in our guidelines. And we do actually have a very short kind of small signage and security section, right? Because what we wanted to avoid was, one, particularly in our neighborhoods, to have a proliferation of, you know, pull down shutters and security gates and things that really kind of don't contribute to a very pleasant pedestrian experience, particularly thinking about our commercial corridors. And so we provided some very light guidance in terms of, like, if you feel that you need to do this, it should be done in a way that you know, is more discreet, for example, on the interior of your building, right? So that, and we try to find some examples of that, where, you know, those kind of pull down shutters, et cetera, are actually on the inside of the business. But really, you know, we try to also acknowledge the idea that when you're talking about security and safety, the best thing that you can do is create a sense of transparency and openness, and just kind of visual access in development. And so really kind of focused on that aspect of things, rather than being prescriptive around, essentially bars on commercial storefronts, et cetera.
And from the suburban perspective, in our design guidelines, in our design review, and some of our master plans, we are kind of in the design of landscaping. Is it obscuring areas? Can the police, as they're going through neighborhoods, is it easy to monitor? While lighting oftentimes is objectionable, so for instance, if you have a bulb that is viewable, rather than having it be cut-off fixture where it's just projecting light down in a more aesthetic manner, if that is the case and that's the desired design component, well, maybe there needs to be a lot more of those fixtures compared to a visible bulb that would be projecting light in 360 degrees. So we do have some of those types of features in our design guidelines.
Okay. Any comments on the second part of the question regarding design guidelines for special populations? Has that come up in either one of your communities? Thoughts on it? I just put also, everyone, I just put 3 links in the chat box for all of you. One was a link to the Glenview ordinance page so that you can take a look at the design guidelines. And then the other one, what is this? From the Chicago, the 10 principles, 10 something. Whatever that, what was that? We just talked about it.
So the 10 design excellence principles, as well as our neighborhood design.
That's right. Thank you. So I included that, and then the last thing I included was the PIS memo regarding autism and planning and design standards. So any comments on these special populations?
I can take a pass at that. So it's a challenge, obviously, because you want guidelines to be flexible enough to allow for to really be universal in design, to use that phrase, universal design guidelines. We certainly incorporate those into our principles to making sure that places are welcoming, accessible to the largest extent of the population possible in all regards. I think the challenge comes in when you try to sort of call out individual groups. You're always going to leave somebody out, right? If you specifically call out certain groups, someone else is going to feel left out. So I think approaching it from a universal standpoint, I think is the right way to do it for at the city level. And I think to take it further, though, I think it's important beyond the guidelines in the review process to engage these special groups. We have the office for mayor's office for disabled people, disabled persons. We working with groups that are sort of advocates for their populations is the best way to sort of get the result that's going to work with the guidelines, but also benefit those communities.
And I'll just add to that from my perspective, our mayor's office for people with disability does participate in the plan review process. And so from that perspective, they're able to weigh in. But really our design guidelines talk about accommodating peoples of all abilities and identities. So I think we really do kind of embrace that notion of universal design.
Okay, thank you. It is time to wrap up, and we still have so many good questions. So everyone, thank you for attending our session today. As a reminder, we are recording the session and we'll have it up on our YouTube channel probably sometime on Monday. Thanks to APA Illinois for hosting today's session, and for all of our panelists. We appreciate you for spending your Friday with us and talking about design guidelines. Everyone, don't forget to head over to ohioplanning.org/planning webcast to register for our upcoming sessions. Don't forget to log those CM credits. And everyone, have a great weekend, and we will talk next time. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.